For Grant Mercer, the engine's drone was a shield. This flight was his ritual, and Ranger, his dog, always slept. But not today. The German Shepherd was suddenly on his feet, whining, pressing himself against the cockpit window, staring intently down at an island. It was an island Grant had flown over 100 times, a place of nothing but rock and pine. Grant, annoyed that his sacred silence had been shattered, banked the plane lower, ready to scold the dog. But then he saw at a formation down below that could not have been natural. 3 massive letters spelled out with broken logs and boulders screamed silently up from the empty beach, an SOS, from a place where there was supposed to be no life. Grant had to make a choice: ignore it and hold on to his peace, or descend into that dead zone and face whatever or whoever had created them. We invite you to show your support by subscribing to the channel. The drone of the Lycoming engine was the only constant. It was a deep, resonating thrum that vibrated through the metal frame of the 1975 Cessna 185, through the pedals beneath Grant's boots, and right up into his very bones. For Grant Mercer, this sound wasn't noise. It was a shield, the very wall he built around himself 3,000 feet above the cold, jagged coastline of Maine. Grant glanced over at the instrument panel, his eyes methodically scanning the dials, with the discipline drilled into him decades ago. Altitude steady, airspeed steady, fuel oil pressure. Everything was in order. He was a man of 45, but the reflection staring back from the dark glass of the altimeter looked much older. His face was a map of hard-won miles, weathered by wind and sun, and etched with lines that told of a life lived outdoors, and of a past that refused to stay buried. His brown hair, a little too long and unruly, was silvered at the temples, tucked back beneath his headset. This was his ritual, performed 3 times a week. As long as the notoriously unpredictable Maine weather allowed, he would fly. He would leave his small, isolated cabin on the coast, unhook the tie-downs on his old float plane, and climb into the sky. This was not for pleasure, not for the sheer joy of flying, though he'd known that feeling once a lifetime ago. Now it was just maintenance. A disciplined route, a precise grid pattern over the water. He soared above the endless miles of forest and the vast gray sheet of the Atlantic Ocean. The sky felt like a beautiful empty prison, and he was its only willing prisoner. The constant deafening roar of the engine was a welcome blessing. It was a wall of sound, just loud enough to drown out the echoes that haunted him. Those echoes were always there, waiting for him in the quiet of his cabin. They hid in the stillness between waves crashing on the shore, and in the dead of night they became the sounds of shouting. Shouting in a language he still understood, mixed with the sharp metallic clang of equipment, and always the final choked cry of his friend Colton. This flight was his ritual to escape it. The drone of the engine was the only thing that could keep those ghosts at bay. Beside him in the co-pilot's seat, his only companion began to stir. His name was Ranger, a handsome 6-year-old German Shepherd. He was a magnificent creature of gray and white, with intelligent amber eyes that never missed a thing. Ranger wasn't just a pet. He was a partner, the only other living soul that Grant allowed into his tightly controlled world. Ranger was his anchor. He was his early warning system, a dog who understood the landscape of Grant's pain. He understood it better than any person ever could, sensing the first tremors of a bad memory, long before it broke through to the surface. But right now, Ranger was calm, his head resting peacefully on his paws. His gaze was fixed straight ahead. He was used to the flight, used to the noise. He was part of the ritual. Grant reached over his gloved hand, finding the familiar shape of the dog's head. He gave a scratch behind those alert, upright ears. "Just us, Ranger," Grant murmured, though his voice was completely swallowed by the engine's roar. They flew onward over gray water that stretched all the way to a gray horizon. They passed over small, deserted islands, lumps of dark granite covered in dense pine trees. They looked like forgotten pieces of the world. Grant glanced down at his watch. Another 15 minutes and he could turn back. The ritual would be complete, and he could finally land. He could tie down the plane and retreat to the quiet safety of his cabin. All before the sun began to set. But then the ritual was broken. It didn't start with a sound, but with a sudden shift in the cabin's atmosphere. Ranger shot his head up his ears, swiveling as a low, anxious whine rumbled deep in his chest, barely audible over the engine. That was all it took. Grant's hand resting on the yoke tensed immediately. He glanced over at the dog. "What is it?" Ranger was already standing up, straining as much as his harness would allow, planting his front paws on the dashboard. His claws made a light clicking sound against the plastic. He wasn't looking at Grant. His gaze was locked on the ocean far below. He was focused on a dark shape that was growing larger, Moose Call Island, a desolate, wind-swept pile of rocks known only to lobstermen and seagulls. "It's nothing, Ranger, just rocks." But Ranger only grew more insistent, his whine climbing higher in pitch. It was a sound of genuine distress as he pushed his wet nose against the windshield. His body trembled slightly, and Grant felt a hot flash of annoyance. This was not part of their ritual. The ritual was smooth, predictable, and empty. This was a complication. He scanned the waters around the island. A submerged rock. A stranded seal. He banked the old Cessna, the wing dipping, giving him a clear view of the island. It was exactly as he remembered it. Sheer cliffs covered 3 sides with a small, crescent-shaped beach on the sheltered side. It was choked with driftwood and seaweed, and he almost missed it. It was just a tangle of dark lines on the gray sand. Grant squinted and circled lower. The engine's pitch changed as he eased back on the throttle. The plane descended, and the lines resolved into 3 distinct shapes. S. O. S. Grant stared his mind, refusing to process the image for a full second. The letters were huge, spelled out in dark stones and massive pieces of driftwood stark against the pale sand. His first reaction was not compassion. It was a deep and sudden anger. An intrusion. This was his sky, his empty sanctuary, and someone had dragged the messy, desperate problems of the world into it. People. They were always a complication. His instinct, sharp and immediate, was to pull back on the yoke climb to his cruising altitude and just fly on. He had left that world behind. He wasn't a rescuer. He wasn't a soldier. Not anymore. He was just a man trying to survive his own memories, and he had nothing left to give. And he did not want to get involved. He had seen where involvement led. It was the kind of thinking that got men like Colton killed, left to die in the dust. He leveled the plane, his jaw tight. His gaze was locked on the horizon, determined to leave the island behind, but Ranger wasn't having any of it. The dog started barking a sharp, frantic sound that sliced right through the drone of the engine. He pawed at the dashboard, then whipped his head around, staring at Grant with a look of such solid certainty, such desperate pleading, that Grant's determination started to crumble. The dog knew. He always knew. Grant's eyes darted from the dog back to the desperate message on the sand. The letters looked small, pathetic, and terrifyingly real. He let out a long, ragged sigh that seemed to rise from the very deepest, most tired part of his soul. The annoyance vanished, replaced by a cold, familiar sense of resignation. He trusted Ranger's instincts more than his own. That dog was his true north, the one thing in this world that had never lied to him, never let him down. If Ranger said there was trouble, then there was trouble. "All right," Grant said, his voice a gravelly rumble. He clicked the button on his headset's mic, even though he knew he was only talking to the dog. "All right, Ranger. We'll take a look." "Not." He banked the plane sharply, the engine groaning in protest as he eased back on the throttle, lining up with the small, sheltered cove. He lowered the flaps. The ritual was broken. The world, with all its noise and all its pain, had found him again. Grant Mercer and his dog Ranger were going down. The world dissolved from a loud, vibrating blur into a spray of white water. Grant cut the engine, and the sudden profound silence was more jarring than the engine's roar had ever been. The deep hum that had been his shield for the last hour was gone, and in its place, silence. A thick, heavy, unnatural quiet that seemed to press in on the thin metal skin of the Cessna. The only sound was the gentle, rhythmic lapping of water against the aluminum floats. Grant just sat there for a long moment, the quiet ringing in his ears. It felt wrong. It felt exposed. Ranger, who had stopped whining, now stood on the co-pilot's seat. his body rigid, his amber eyes locked on the gray beach just 50 yards away. "Okay," Grant said, his own voice sounding loud and rusty in the stillness. He unbuckled his seatbelt, moving with a practiced efficiency, a motion that came from long habit. From behind his seat, he grabbed his old brown leather flight jacket, worn smooth in places. Its leather was creased and dark, smelling faintly of oil and the cold ocean air. It felt like an old friend, a piece of armor, and he shrugged it on. Underneath, holstered on his belt, was his Sig Sauer P-226. He never flew without it. He made sure the firearm was secure, his hand brushing against the cold steel. Next, he reached for Ranger's harness, a professional-grade piece of tactical gear. This was no ordinary civilian leash. Grant's hands moved with skill, clicking the buckles into place over the dog's powerful shoulders as Ranger stood perfectly still. He accepted the gear, knowing this meant it was time for work. Grant then grabbed a small, waterproof dry bag. He checked its contents: a compact first aid kit, a satellite phone, a coil of rope, and a flashlight. He slung the bag over his shoulder and opened the cabin door. The hinges let out a small groan of protest as the cold, damp, salt air rushed in. He stepped out onto the plane's float, his boots making a hollow sound on the metal surface. With practiced efficiency, he tied the plane's rope to a large, half-submerged rock, making the knot secure. Ranger followed, moving low and balanced before leaping from the float into the shallow water. With just a quiet splash, they waded the final few feet to the shore. The sand felt coarse underfoot, littered with sharp, broken shells and thick strands of dark seaweed. Up close, the SOS sign was even more unsettling. The stones were large, the driftwood logs heavy. It would have taken a lot of time and desperation to build this. Grant scanned the beach, his eyes moving in short, precise arcs from left to right, all the way up to the tree line. There was nothing, not a single movement. The island was eerily still. The wind that had battered the plane at 1,000 feet was completely absent here, blocked by the towering granite cliffs that surrounded the small cove. Ranger, on the other hand, was already on the job. He wasn't running or barking. His nose was already to the ground. His plumed tail was low and steady, and he paid no attention to the SOS sign at all. Instead, he moved right past it, heading toward the only break in the dense, dark forest of spruce and pine. "What do you have, Ranger?" Grant murmured quietly, as Ranger moved forward, his paws silent on the damp sand. He got to the start of the trail and froze, not even glancing back as his whole body tensed up. A low rumble, almost too quiet to hear, vibrated deep in his chest. It wasn't a bark, and it wasn't a warning. It was a deep, controlled growl, and Grant's hand immediately moved from his side. It went straight to the grip of his pistol, his thumb instinctively finding the safety strap. He walked slowly, closing the gap between him and the dog, his eyes carefully scanning the dark woods ahead. "Easy, boy," he murmured as he reached Ranger's side and finally saw what his dog had discovered. It was lying just off the trail, partly concealed by a patch of tall, wild grass. It was also covered by a scattering of disturbed leaves, as though someone had accidentally kicked it there. It was a hunting knife, a big one, with a dark composite handle and a wide, menacing blade. The blade was caked with a dark, reddish-brown substance that was no longer fresh or wet. But it wasn't old, either. This had happened recently, maybe just a few days ago. This was a sign of violence, and the switch in Grant's mind flipped in an instant. All the annoyance, the reluctance, the utter weariness he'd been feeling, it all just vanished. His cold resignation was replaced by an even colder, sharper sense of clarity. The ghosts of his past, the very things he flew to escape, were no longer a burden. Now they were his tools. The soldier he had tried so hard to leave behind took complete control, and his first thought wasn't of a victim. His first thought was pure procedure, a threat assessment. He did not touch the knife. He didn't take a single step into the woods. He looked at Ranger and gave a command, "Back." His voice was a low, sharp whisper, and Ranger obeyed without a moment's hesitation. The dog backed away from the trail, his eyes remaining locked on the dark opening to the woods. Grant moved back right along with him, his hand never leaving the grip of his weapon. His gaze stayed fixed on the tree line as he moved quickly, but without breaking into a run. He retreated across the sand, his boots crunching on the shells back towards the water's edge and back to his plane. He climbed onto the plane's float, and Ranger leaped up right beside him. Grant slid into the cockpit, his heart now pounding in his chest. But it wasn't from fear. It was a surge of pure adrenaline. This had just become a tactical situation, and the first rule in any tactical situation is communication. He grabbed the radio handset. "Mayday, mayday, mayday," he said into the mic. His voice was perfectly level. "This is Cessna, November 5185 Kilo on the coast of Moose Call Island. I have found evidence of a violent encounter and sent out a distress call requesting immediate assistance." Then he released the button. The only thing that came back was a loud, empty hiss of static. He tried again on channel 16, the universal emergency frequency. "Mayday, mayday. Any station, this is Cessna 85 Kilo. Do you read me?" Just more static. His stomach tightened into a knot as he flipped the switch for the main comms radio. He quickly dialed in the frequency for the nearest Coast Guard station located in Bar Harbor. Still nothing but static, just a wall of empty noise. He reached for the dry bag, his fingers fumbling for a second with the clip. Inside, he pulled out the satellite phone, a heavy, rugged piece of gear he saved for emergencies just like this one. He flipped open the cover and turned it on. The screen came to life, the display reading, "Searching for network." Grant held his breath, watching the small icon on the screen. It flashed, then changed into a single, stark message, "No signal." He stared at it in disbelief, moving the phone all around the cockpit, even holding it up to the windshield. It was no use. The message remained. "No," he whispered. A sinking, sickening feeling washed over him as he finally understood. The island. It wasn't merely a physical fortress. The towering granite cliffs that encircled the cove, the very ones that sheltered it from the wind, were also blocking everything else. They had created a perfect, natural bowl, a complete dead zone. He was as cut off from the world as the person who had scrawled SOS in the sand. He slumped back in his seat. The cockpit's silence pressed in on him again. His gaze shifted from the woods to his silent radios. He realized he had two choices. He could start the engine takeoff and fly back to the mainland. It would likely take him 30 minutes just to get high enough to find a signal. It might be an hour before he could return with help. A whole hour. He thought about the blood he'd seen on the knife. An hour could be an eternity. His mind went back to Colton bleeding out in the dust and the rescue helicopters that had shown up just 5 minutes too late. His other choice was to stay. He looked at Ranger. The dog had stopped looking toward the trail and was now focused on Grant, his gaze steady and patient. He was waiting for a command, waiting for his partner to make the decision. And it seemed Ranger already knew what that decision would be. Grant ran a hand over his face, the rough stubble of his jaw scraping his palm. This whole situation was no longer just an annoyance. It was his duty, a failed communications check, a missing partner. This was a mission now, whether he liked it or not. He let out a long, slow breath. The feeling of resignation returned, but this time it was different. It was heavy, but it was solid. It was the weight of purpose. "All right, Ranger," Grant said, his voice quiet but firm as he clipped the satellite phone back onto his belt. Its screen was dark, useless. "We're on our own." He picked up the dry bag, stepped out onto the float, and with his dog at his side, waded back to the island's shore. Grant gave the command with a simple downward gesture of his left hand. "Lead on." Ranger, needing no other cue, turned from the beach and entered the dark opening of the trail. The dog moved in a way Grant had seen 1,000 times in training, but never for real. He was no longer just a companion. He was a tool, a living sensor array. He moved low his body, a silent gray and white shadow, placing each paw with deliberate care, his nose constantly testing the air. His ears swiveled, catching the slightest disturbance. Grant followed his own movements, an echo of the dog's. He fell into the rhythm that had been drilled into him at Fort Bragg. His boots, which had crunched loudly on the beach's shells, were now silent on the soft, pine-needle-covered earth. He moved in a crouch, his senses flaring outward. The forest was dense, far darker than the open beach. The air was heavy damp, and smelled of salt decaying pine and the sharp metallic tang of the nearby ocean. The silence was absolute. There were no birds, no squirrels. The only sound was the faint, distant rhythm of the waves lapping the shore behind them, and the sound of his own controlled breathing. He kept his eyes locked on Ranger, watching the subtle shifts in the dog's body language. They moved inland, maybe 50 yards. The trail was narrow, hemmed in on both sides by thick walls of spruce and fir. Grant felt the oppressive weight of the cliffs above him, the same granite that had blocked his radio signal. He was in a stone cup, a trap. Ranger stopped. Grant froze instantly, his hand moving from his belt to the grip of his Sig Sauer, his body melting behind the trunk of a massive pine. He waited. Ranger didn't growl. He simply stood his head raised, slightly tasting the air. He took one more step, then looked back at Grant with a clear, intelligent glance. Ranger was signaling, so Grant moved up to flank the dog, peering cautiously around the tree. The forest opened up into a small, natural clearing, perhaps 30 feet across. It was a pocket of human presence in the deep wild, and it felt wrong. Everything about it felt wrong. It was a campsite, but it looked as if it had been struck by a sudden violent wind. In the center was a small, cold fire pit, just a circle of stones filled with damp, dark ash. Beside it, an aluminum kettle lay on its side, a dark stain seeping into the dirt beneath it. A small blue dome tent was set up near the back, but it was partially collapsed, the rain fly flapping loosely from one side like a broken wing. It was the mess, the scattering of personal items, that told the story of panic. A pair of women's hiking boots, high quality but scuffed, were kicked over near the tent's entrance, as if their owner had been pulled right out of them or had scrambled away in a desperate hurry. A bright yellow rain poncho was snagged on a nearby bush, fluttering like a flag of surrender. There was a single overturned enamel mug, and a waterproof bag with its contents, a map, a compass, a bag of trail mix spilled onto the ground. The whole scene screamed, hastily abandoned. "Clear," Grant whispered more to himself than to the dog. He gave Ranger the signal to watch, and Ranger instantly understood his job. The dog moved to the center of the clearing near the fire pit, but he didn't sniff the ground. He didn't investigate the tent. Instead, he faced the dark woods on the opposite side of the camp, the direction they had not yet explored. He stood perfectly still, a gray and white sentinel, his body tense and his ears erect. He was guarding Grant's back, and Grant trusted the dog with his life. He holstered his weapon but kept his hand resting on the grip as he began his own methodical search. He moved to the tent. The zipper was torn, the fabric ripped clean away from the track. He pulled the flap aside. It was empty, though 2 sleeping bags were unrolled inside, one blue, one green. A backpack was overturned, its contents spilled out just like the bag outside. It was a scene of sudden, complete interruption. He stepped back, his eyes scanning the perimeter. What happened here? The blood on the knife. Had the person who used it come here, or had they been taken from here? His gaze then fell on a log that had been dragged near the fire pit, clearly being used as a bench. The yellow poncho he'd spotted snagged on the bush was partially draped over it. Something was tucked underneath, and he lifted the damp, slick fabric. It was a book, a journal bound in simple, dark leather. It was soaked through on one side, the cover warped and stiff from the moisture. A simple leather strap held it closed, and Grant felt a cold knot tighten in the pit of his stomach. This was the voice he was looking for. This was the answer. He looked over at Ranger. The dog hadn't moved. The dog was a statue of perfect, alert stillness. Grant moved over to the edge of the clearing, settling himself against a large, moss-covered boulder. The rock was cold and hard against his back, but it gave him a solid position from which he could see the whole camp. He could see the trail they had come from, and he could still see Ranger. He balanced his sidearm on his knee, his hand resting on it, while with his other hand he worked at the stiff leather strap of the journal. It came free with a soft sucking sound. He opened the book. The first several pages were stiff, and the paper was warped while the ink a dark blue had blurred in spots from the damp, but it was still legible. The handwriting was a strong, leer feminine script. The first page was simply a name. This journal belongs to Marina. Grant felt a jolt. A name. She wasn't just a sign or a victim anymore. Marina. He skipped past the first several entries. They were dated and written from Bar Harbor, their tone cheerful. Sailing with Noah. The weather is perfect. He's so happy. Grant's thumb moved faster now, the pages making a soft, damp, ripping sound as he searched for the change. And then he found it. The handwriting had changed. It was no longer neat, but rushed and sprawling, the letters pressed so hard into the paper. Storm came out of nowhere. Rogue wave. The boat, it's gone. Noah is hurt. His leg. We swam. Made it to a beach, an island. Just rocks and trees, we're alive. Grant kept reading his pulse, a low drum in his ears. He found the entry that mattered. It was dated simply day 3. Noah's fever is concerning. I cleaned the wound, but it's bad. I'm scared, but we did something good. We finished the SOS sign on the beach. We used the big rocks from the cliff and all the heavy driftwood. It's big. It has to be. Someone has to see it. Someone has to fly over. Please, someone see it. Grant closed the journal. His hand tightened on the worn cover. Marina? Noah. They were real. He looked up from the page, the desperate hope in her words hanging in the dead, silent air of the camp. He glanced at the overturned kettle, at the abandoned boots, and at the cold, empty fire pit. And then his gaze shifted to the trail he'd just walked to, the spot where the blood-stained knife had laid. They had been alive. They had been right here, hoping to be saved. Grant looked over at Ranger. The dog was still watching the woods, unblinking. He knew what Grant now knew: they were not alone. And the people who wrote this journal hadn't simply walked away. Grant's hand was numb from the cold. He realized he had been sitting against the boulder for several minutes, the open journal resting in his lap. The silence of the camp was a physical weight. He looked up, his eyes scanning the clearing. Ranger hadn't moved an inch. The German shepherd stood like a gray and white statue near the cold fire pit, his head and tail held perfectly level. His entire focus was fixed on the dark trail across the way. The dog's discipline was a silent reassurance. It was the only thing grounding Grant in the present. He looked back down at the journal. Marina. Her name felt heavy in his thoughts. He had read the SOS entry, but there were still more pages. He turned the damp, warped paper. The neat, hopeful script of the first days was beginning to fray. Day 4. Noah is worse. The fever won't break. I did my best to clean the wound on his leg again, the one from the boat, but it's looking angry. Red and inflamed. He's talking, but not to me. He's talking about home. I keep scanning the horizon. Nothing. Just water. I have to stay strong. He needs me. Grant's own breath felt thin in his chest. He recognized this feeling, this kind of slow creeping dread. It was worse than being in a firefight. It was the dread of the inevitable, the slow decay of hope. He turned to the page. Day 6. I'm so tired. The cold. It gets into everything. Even the fire doesn't seem to help much. Noah didn't eat this morning. He just stares. I read to him from this one book we saved, but I don't think he even hears me. I'm so scared the SOS isn't big enough. What if they can't see it? What if no one comes? Grant's jaw clenched as he found himself scanning the empty clearing. It was as if he was looking for her, a woman who was just a ghost on a page. He saw the overturned boots near the tent and imagined her sitting right here in this very spot, writing these words, her hands shaking from the cold and the fear. He turned to the final page, and the change was like a physical shock. It wasn't the same handwriting. This wasn't writing at all. It was a wound on the paper, a frantic scrawl, pressed so hard that the pen had torn through the page, in places the ink smeared as if by rain or tears. He had to squint to make out the words Day 7. They saw it. They saw the SOS. A boat. Not the Coast Guard, just a boat. Washed up on the north side, looked like it was in trouble too. 2 men. They looked at us. They looked cold. Grant's blood ran from cold to ice. His pulse, which had been a low drum, suddenly spiked. The writing went on. It sprawled across the bottom of the page, the last words jammed into the corner. They left. Just left us here. Said they'd be back. But the way they looked at Noah, the way they looked at me, they aren't rescuers. They aren't rescuers. Oh God, they're coming back. The last 3 words were barely legible. Grant just stared at them. Coming back. The world tilted. The damp, cold smell of the Maine forest was gone. In an instant, his nostrils were filled with the fine, choking dust of the Kunar province. The year was 2011. It wasn't a memory, it was a sensation. The sudden biting cold of a high desert night, the oppressive silence before an operation. That specific metallic taste of fear that every soldier comes to know. The taste of adrenaline mixed with stale water. He was on overwatch, lying on a ridge. The world was a blurry green through his night vision, and he was waiting for the enemy to move. He was waiting for the trap to spring. It was the helplessness, the same kind of helplessness, that bled from Marina's final words. He remembered the static of the radio in his ear. Then the sudden chaotic burst of noise, the sharp cracks of rifle fire, erupting from the valley below. And then Colton's voice, so young. Grant, they're everywhere. We're pinned down, I'm pinned. Grant remembered his own voice screaming commands over the radio. He was trying to get a location, trying to direct fire, but he was on the ridge 1,000 meters away. He was too far. He was helpless. Colton talked to me. Where are you, Silence? Then just a whisper came across the hot mic. Grant, they're coming back. A final burst of gunfire followed. Then there was nothing. Just the ringing in his ears and the sound of his own ragged breath. It echoed in the vast, cold dark. They had found Colton 4 hours later. Grant had been the one to carry him out. He had failed him. He, the team leader, the protector, had been helpless, and Colton had died because of it. Grant's hand clenched into a fist, his knuckles turning bone white. The cheap leather cover of the journal groaned in his grip. A sudden movement made Grant's head snap up. His hand flew to his sidearm, pulling the weapon free in one smooth, practiced motion. His heart was a jackhammer pounding against his ribs. Ranger the dog hadn't moved. He was still standing watch. A perfect, unwavering sentinel. He hadn't sensed the ghosts of the past. He was focused on the present. Grant let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. The smell of pine and salt rushed back in. He was in Maine. He was on the island. The dust of Afghanistan was gone, but the feeling remained. He looked down at the journal. He saw the last terrified words and then looked at the empty women's boots by the tent. Marina. Noah. They were not strangers. They were not just names on a page. They were Colton. They were the mission he had failed, the promise he had broken. He had run away to this empty coast, flown his ritualistic patterns in the sky, and surrounded himself with silence. All of it was to escape that one feeling, the helplessness of that night in 2011. Now here it was again. But this time it was different. He was not on a ridge 1,000 meters away. He was here. He was on the ground. The people who wrote this journal, the ones who were terrified of the men who were coming back, they were his responsibility. He holstered his weapon. He carefully closed the journal, placing it, with a tenderness he hadn't known he possessed, into the dry bag at his side. This wasn't just an intrusion anymore. It was no longer a simple complication. This was personal. He pushed himself up, his joints stiff from the cold rock. He looked over at Ranger. The dog turned his head, his amber eyes locking with Grant's. Grant gave a single sharp nod. The decision was made. He would not be helpless. He would not let another voice be silenced. He would not fail again. Grant Mercer stood, the stiffness in his knees, a dull, distant ache. The chill from the granite boulder had seeped into him, but it was nothing compared to the ice water of clarity now flooding his veins. The journal was secure in his dry bag. Its terrible, frantic last words burned into his mind. This was no longer a rescue mission. It was a recovery, and it was personal. He looked at Ranger. The dog still held his watch, a perfect model of disciplined patience. He hadn't moved from his spot, his body a rigid line, his gaze still fixed on the dark, narrow trail that led away from the opposite side of the clearing. That was the direction the ripped tent flap and the overturned boots pointed to. It suggested a violent, panicked exit away from the beach, away from the trail they had used. It was the direction Marina must have fled, or the direction she was taken. Grant moved to Ranger's side. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. He placed his left hand on the dog's harness, a firm grounding pressure. With his right hand, he unholstered his Sig Sauer, the sound of the Kydex holster releasing the weapon a soft, precise click. He held the pistol in a low, ready position, his finger resting outside the trigger guard. "Track," he whispered. It was the only word spoken. Ranger's entire body tensed for a brief second, acknowledging the command. Then he moved. He didn't bound, and he didn't run. He moved like a gray and white shadow, his nose low to the ground, his paws making no sound on the carpet of pine needles. He was following a scent invisible to Grant, a trail of terror and desperation, left hours or maybe days before. Grant moved behind him, stepping where the dog stepped, his senses dialed to a level he hadn't used in years. The soldier was fully awake now. His world was a 180-degree arc of responsibility. His eyes scanned the tree line, his ears straining against the crushing silence, listening for the snap of a twig, the scrape of a boot. With the metallic click of a weapon being armed, the island's silence was no longer just creepy. It felt hostile, like a vacuum waiting for a sudden violent sound to shatter it. The path they were on wasn't really a trail. It was just the path of least resistance. Through the thick undergrowth branches heavy with damp moss snagged at his leather jacket. He pushed them aside, his gaze fixed forward. He was focused on Ranger's tail, a steady plume that curved downward. As long as that tail stayed steady, they were on the scent. They pressed on for 10 minutes. The campsite vanished behind them, the sound of the ocean fading to a distant, ghostly whisper. They were deep in the island's interior, now a place of shadows and ancient, silent trees. Ranger stopped. He didn't just stop. He froze mid-stride, his left front paw raised, his head locked in place, his nose pointed to a spot just off the faint path. Grant stopped instantly, his heart a cold, heavy weight in his chest, as he raised the pistol. His eyes scanned the area Ranger was indicating, but he saw nothing. There was just a tangle of ferns and a large spruce tree. Ranger lowered his head, a low, anxious whine vibrating in his chest. He took a hesitant step toward the spruce, then looked back at Grant, his amber eyes wide. "What is it, boy?" Grant murmured, moving up to provide cover for the dog. Then he saw it. It was not a natural formation at the base of the spruce tree. There was a pile of dead branches and pine boughs layered over a heap of dry leaves. It looked wrong. The branches were too fresh, the breaks in the wood showing pale, raw wounds. The leaves were dry, scooped from a different part of the forest floor, not belonging in this damp hollow. It was a pile, a deliberate and hastily constructed pile, about 3 feet long. Grant's blood ran cold. He had seen this before. This was a hidden stash, or it was a grave. Ranger whined again more insistently. He moved to the edge of the pile and began to dig. His front paws moved in a rapid scratching motion, throwing leaves and dirt behind him. He wasn't playing. He was frantic. This was the scent. "Hold, Ranger," Grant commanded, his voice tight. The dog's urgency was a bad sign. "Hold." Ranger paused, panting, and looked back at Grant. "I'll do it." Grant kept his pistol trained on the dark woods with his right hand as he knelt with his left. He reached forward, pulling at the freshly cut pine boughs. They came away easily, releasing a sharp, clean scent of resin that did nothing to mask the smell underneath. It was a damp, earthy smell mixed with something else, something coppery. He tossed the branches aside. Underneath was a pile of dry leaves. He swept them away with his forearm, his leather sleeve snagging on the twigs. His gloved fingers brushed against fabric, and his breath caught in his throat. He jammed his pistol back into its holster, freeing up both his hands. He dug his fingers into the damp earth beneath the leaves and pulled. It wasn't a body. He exhaled a sharp, sudden rush of air. It was a piece of clothing. He pulled it free from the shallow depression. It was a man's jacket, a heavy dark wool jacket, the kind a sailor or a fisherman might wear. It was soaked through with dampness and dirt, but it was unmistakably a jacket, and it was stained. He laid it out on the ground. A large, dark, stiff stain covered the entire left shoulder and spread across the chest. There was no mistaking it. Even in the dim light of the forest, he could see the dark, oxidized color. It was blood, a lot of it. This was Noah's. This was the wound Marina had written about. This was the source of the blood on the knife. Grant knelt, staring at the jacket, his mind suddenly a cold engine of calculation. He processed the scene, and a new, terrible understanding settled over him. Fact 1, the campsite was a scene of pure, unadulterated panic. Overturned boots, a ripped tent, scattered gear. It was the picture of a sudden, chaotic attack. Fact 2, this jacket, the primary evidence of that attack, was not at the campsite. It was here, hundreds of yards away, deliberately hidden under a pile of freshly cut branches. The two facts were a contradiction. Panic and concealment are opposites. A panicked attacker, a smuggler surprised and angry, would have left the evidence right there. They would have acted with brutality and fled. An animal would have dragged the body, but you don't hide evidence in a panic. You hide evidence when you have a plan. You hide evidence when you're worried about someone else finding it. You hide evidence when you're trying to control the story. This wasn't just some random attack. This wasn't a crime of passion. This was a calculated move to hide the truth by the men from the boat, the ones Marina was so afraid of. They weren't just brutal. They were smart, and they were methodical. They were still here, and they were covering their tracks. Grant got to his feet. The blood-stained, mud-caked jacket was still in his hand as he looked at Ranger. The dog was no longer digging. He was watching his partner, waiting for the next order. The game had changed. This was no longer a rescue mission for a badly injured man. This was now an infiltration into hostile territory against an enemy who was thinking, planning, and waiting, an enemy who was right now somewhere on this small, silent, inescapable island with Marina and Noah. The light was failing, and it wasn't a gentle golden dusk, but a cold gray light that was draining all the color from the world as the sun dipped behind the western cliff face of the island, plunging the dense forest into an early twilight. The air grew heavy and cold, the temperature dropping fast. Grant knelt in the gloom, the bloody wool jacket in his hands. The coppery smell of old blood was sharp in the damp air. He looked from the carefully hidden evidence to the darkening woods all around him. This was no place to be at night. A tracker could work in the dark, but a man walking into a planned ambush could not. The rules had changed. "We're going back," he said, his voice a low rumble, as he folded the jacket, Noah's jacket, and tucked it inside his own against his chest. It was a cold, damp weight, a tangible piece of the puzzle he would not leave behind. "Heel," he commanded. Ranger, who had been patiently standing guard, moved instantly to Grant's left side, his shoulder brushing against Grant's knee. They began the trek back to the campsite, a journey that felt 10 times longer than the one they had just taken. Grant moved with a focused, silent intensity. The forest was no longer a place to be investigated. It was a place to be survived. Every shadow that pooled between the massive tree trunks was a potential hiding place. Every whisper of wind through the high pine branches sounded like a man's breathing. His hand never left the grip of his pistol. Ranger was a perfect reflection of Grant's own tension, the dog's powerful body coiled like a spring. His head was held low, his ears swiveling, sampling every scent on the night air. He was a 90-pound predator on high alert. It had taken them a full 20 minutes to reach the clearing, and by that time the world had become a deep, starless, inky black. The small camp was just a pool of deeper shadows, the ripped tent a ghostly shape flapping in the dark. Grant's first priority was security. There was no way he could go back to the plane. It was far too exposed out on the water, and this clearing with its single trail was a tough spot to defend. It was a poor defensive position, but it was all they had to work with. He gave Ranger a quiet command to take a watch post near the trail they had just used. And just like that, the dog disappeared into the darkness. Grant, meanwhile, began his own patrol. He did a slow, silent check of the perimeter and found a spot against the same mossy boulder. He had rested there earlier. It gave him a solid back and a clear view of the clearing. From there, he could watch both trails leading into it as the cold of the rock seeped through his jacket. He was used to the cold. He was used to the dark. And he was absolutely used to the waiting. He listened as the island's heavy, oppressive silence returned. This time it was filled with the tiny, rustling sounds of the night, and he began to catalog them. He was sorting the natural sounds from the unnatural when Ranger reappeared without a warning. The dog simply materialized at Grant's side, a silent gray and white shadow. He pressed his cold, wet nose into Grant's hand, and then he growled. This was not the controlled, alert sound he'd made on the trail. This was a deep rumble that vibrated through his chest. It was a gut-wrenching sound, a true threat. And Ranger wasn't looking at the trail. The one they'd come from was clear. He was staring at a dense patch of boulders and ferns. It was on the far side of the clearing. Grant's hand was already on his pistol. He raised it, pointing it into the blackness. "Who's there?" he commanded. His voice was a low, hard bark, designed to intimidate, designed to take control. At first, there was only silence. Then he heard a distinctly human sound. It was a low, painful groan. "Stay back, Ranger," Grant whispered. Ranger whined, his whole body trembling with a restrained, violent energy, but he held his ground. "I said, who is there?" Grant called out, his voice louder this time. "Show yourself, hands first." The voice was a cracked, desperate whisper. "Please, don't shoot. I'm hurt." A figure moved. It was a man crawling. He was dragging himself from the shadows of the rocks, a dark shape against the stone. He pulled himself along the ground with his arms, his left leg trailing uselessly behind him. He emerged into the faint, residual light of the clearing. His hands were held up, trembling. "Please!" he panted. "Help me!" He was a man in his early 40s. His face was pale and slick with sweat, his eyes wide with what looked like sheer terror. He was wearing expensive torn sailing gear. When he saw Grant, a large, dark figure holding a gun, his eyes widened even more. He flinched. No, please, did they send you? Are they back?" Grant kept his pistol steady. Ranger was now on his feet, his teeth bared the growl, a constant, menacing thrum. "Easy, Ranger," Grant said, his voice firm. The dog quieted, but didn't relax an inch. "Who are you?" Grant asked. The man collapsed onto his side, his breath hitching in a sob. I'm Tanner. My wife, Marina. We were on the boat. Did you see her? Is she—" The name was a punch to the gut, Tanner. It aligned perfectly with the journal. Grant's mind raced, trying to fit the pieces together. The man was performing. He had to be. "What happened?" Grant asked, his voice still hard, betraying no emotion. The men," Tanner gasped, clutching his leg. "The other boat. Smugglers, I don't know. They found us yesterday. They were animals." His voice broke. They took Marina. She tried to fight, and I think they killed her. I really think they killed her." He was sobbing now, a dry, racking sound. Grant's face remained a mask. He didn't believe a word of it, but the performance was good. "And you?" Grant pressed. "I tried," the man choked out. "I tried to stop them, but one of them, he had a knife. He stabbed me." He gestured wildly toward his leg. I ran. I hid. I've been in these rocks ever since. I heard you. I thought you were them coming back to finish me off. Please, you've got to help me." Grant's stare was icy. He was a soldier through and through. And this man was one of three things: a potential asset, a potential threat, or a victim. His training demanded he figure out which one, even though his gut told him this was all a lie. But the memory of Colton, the one he hadn't helped in time, prodded him. For now, his duty was to treat the wounded. "Ranger, watch," he commanded, holstering his weapon. The man flinched as Grant approached, but Grant paid it no mind. He knelt down, pulling the dry bag around. "I have a first aid kit." Thank you. Thank you, Tanner whispered. His eyes rolled back in his head. Grant pulled out his shears. I need to see the wound. It hurts, Tanner moaned. I'm cutting the pant leg. Grant's voice was flat, devoid of emotion. The shears made a sharp ripping sound as they sliced through the expensive blood-soaked sailing pants. Grant pulled the fabric away and got a clear look at the wound. It was bad, a deep, vicious gash on the man's outer thigh. It was a laceration just like he'd said. It wasn't a gunshot wound. It was from a knife, but it was the rest of the scene that set off alarms in Grant's head. The man wasn't bleeding out. The blood flow was sluggish, and around the wound there was a clear, sharp line of demarcation in the caked blood, the distinct impression of a bandage that had been tied on very tightly and for a long time. The wound itself, while deep, had been at least partially cleaned. Grant's field experience, his tactical medical training, all of it screamed at him this was not the wound of a man who'd just been stabbed, run off, and hid in terror. This was not a wound that had been left to bleed out for the past 24 hours. If it had been, the man would be dead from blood loss or in deep hypovolemic shock. This man was coherent. He was articulate. He was putting on a performance. This wound had been dressed. It had been bandaged hours ago, and the man had only just now taken the bandage off, or perhaps it had fallen off to make the scene look more dramatic. I tried to stop it, Tanner moaned as if reading his mind. I used a piece of my shirt. Grant's eyes were like ice. He met the man's gaze. Hold still, he said. This is going to sting. He uncapped the bottle of antiseptic from his kit. He didn't just dab it, he poured it directly into the open gash. The man's reaction was immediate and explosive. He let out a piercing shriek. His entire body arched off the ground. It was a genuine, agonizing scream. At that moment, Grant knew two things for certain. One, the wound was absolutely real and agonizingly painful. Two, the man was lying about everything else. Grant looked up from his work, scanning the clearing. Ranger hadn't relaxed. The dog stood with his lips curled back in a silent, unwavering snarl. He wasn't looking at a victim. He was looking at an enemy. Tanner's shriek had been genuine, a raw sound of agony that had echoed off the granite cliffs and then vanished into the trees, leaving the clearing in a stunned, ringing silence. Grant pulled his hands back. The antiseptic had done its job. He worked quickly now, his hands moving with a medic's impersonal efficiency. He packed the laceration with sterile gauze and wrapped it tightly with a pressure bandage from his kit. The bleeding was controlled. Tanner was panting, his face pale and slick. His eyes were shut tight. He gasped. It's done, Grant said, his voice flat as he repacked his med kit. The man was a liar, but he was also in real, undeniable pain. The two facts existed together, a dangerous combination. He couldn't leave him here. Not because he trusted him, but because he simply couldn't. Leaving a wounded man in the dark, even a lying one, was a tactical liability. A man in that much pain would make noise, attracting whatever else was on this island. And Grant needed to watch him. He was the only link, the only piece of the puzzle that was still breathing. Can you walk? Grant asked. Tanner tried to push himself up, but his face went ashen, and he fell back with a groan. No, I can't. We're moving to the campsite. It's too exposed here. Grant's mind was working. He needed an open, observable space. He needed to keep this man in his line of sight. We can use the tent for a windbreak. It'll be warmer. It was a lie, but it was a logical one. Tanner nodded. His teeth were chattering, but whether from the cold or from shock, it made no difference to Grant. Getting him to the camp was a grueling 10-minute ordeal, and Grant wasn't gentle. He simply hauled Tanner to his feet. With the man's arm slung over his shoulders, Tanner did his best to put weight on his good leg. He was hopping and dragging his injured one, his breath hissing through his teeth with every move. As they moved, Ranger shadowed their every step. He was a gray and white ghost in the darkness, his body held low, his suspicion a force you could almost feel. They finally reached the battered clearing where Grant unceremoniously dropped Tanner near the cold fire pit. He propped him up against the same log Marina had used as a bench. "Stay here," Grant ordered, and he didn't bother waiting for a reply. He moved over to a large boulder, his chosen overwatch position. He needed to build a fire, but not for warmth. He needed it for light, a small, controlled tactical fire, just big enough to see by. He took out his knife and a magnesium stick, shaving off little hot sparks into a ball of dry tinder he'd gathered until a small, smokeless flame finally caught. The fire licked at the kindling and grew, casting a small, flickering circle of orange light. It pushed the oppressive total darkness back by just a few feet. The light made the ripped tent and the scattered gear look like a stage set for a tragedy. Grant sat with his back against the solid rock, his legs crossed, and his pistol resting on his thigh. He was comfortable. He had spent half his life in situations just like this one. Cold, tired, and waiting for an enemy to make a move. He tossed a foil-wrapped ration bar. It sailed across the fire and landed softly in Tanner's lap. Tanner flinched, startled, and then looked down at the bar. Then he looked up at Grant and said, "Thank you." "Eat," Grant said. It was an order, not a suggestion. Tanner fumbled with the wrapper, his hands shaking, and managed to take a small bite. He chewed with difficulty, his eyes moving from Grant, a silent, dark shape against the rock, over to Ranger. The dog had not settled down. He wasn't lying down, and he wasn't sniffing around the camp. He was sitting perfectly still, at the very edge of the firelight, a perfect sphinx-like silhouette. His head was up, his ears were forward, and his amber eyes were reflecting the little flame. And he was staring. He was staring directly at Tanner, who was now trying to bridge the gap. Trying to build the kind of connection fellow victims might share, he tore off a small piece of the ration bar. He held it out, his voice a soft coo, "Here, boy." Tanner said, "Good dog. Are you hungry?" Ranger didn't move. He didn't growl. He didn't even glance at the food. His gaze remained locked on Tanner's face. "He's a good boy, right?" Tanner said, his voice a strained, pathetic attempt to sound friendly. He tossed the piece of food, and it landed in the dirt right in front of the dog. Ranger's reaction was absolute. He didn't sniff it. He didn't even acknowledge it. He simply kept his eyes fixed on Tanner, as if both the food and the man were beneath his notice. After a moment, he deliberately turned his head just slightly away from the offering. It was a snub, a profound, animalistic gesture of pure contempt. Tanner's hand, still outstretched, slowly lowered. He looked at the dog. Then he looked at Grant, whose face was an unreadable shadow. He's well-trained," Tanner said, his voice small, then quickly ate the rest of his energy bar. The night dragged on as the silent psychological battle played out. It was fought in the space around that small, flickering fire. Grant did not sleep. He would close his eyes for 5, maybe 10 seconds at a time, a tactical rest. But his senses stayed sharp. He let the silence do its work. Eventually, Tanner couldn't take it anymore. This island," Tanner whispered. His voice was raspy. It's a terrible place. You're not from around here, are you?" Grant just stared into the fire. He said nothing. I can't believe Marina is gone." Tanner continued, his voice catching. "She was everything. Those men, they were monsters. I hope you find them. I hope you—" Grant cut him off, his voice a low, flat rumble. Without even looking at him, he said, "You should get some rest. We'll move at first light." He wasn't asking questions. He wasn't engaging. He was simply observing. He watched the man's pupils dance in the firelight, noting the rhythm of his feigned grief. He saw the way Tanner clutched his very real wound for emphasis. Rebuffed, Tanner finally fell silent. He leaned his head back against the log, his breathing growing shallow. His eyes closed, and he let out a few theatrical, pain-filled moans before settling into a fitful slumber. He feigned a shallow sleep, his face turned toward the fire, but Grant knew he wasn't out. He was a predator just like Grant, and he was simply waiting through all the long, cold hours. Ranger never slept. The dog didn't lie down. He didn't circle. He sat bolt upright, a sentinel of gray and white, a living lie detector. And he had not moved an inch from his post. He was a statue of pure judgment. His gaze was unwavering, his breath a low, steady puff in the cold. He was guarding his partner. The sky began to bleed from black into a deep, bruised purple. The first cold light of dawn was minutes away. Tanner stirred, waking with a pained groan, blinking his eyes as if rising from a deep sleep. He looked toward the fire now, just a pile of white ash and glowing embers. He looked at Grant, who sat in the same position as before, and then he looked at Ranger. The dog was still staring directly at him. Tanner, perhaps in a moment of frustration, or maybe in one last desperate attempt to prove he was a harmless victim, tried again. "Good boy," Tanner whispered, his voice thick and syrupy. "You've been watching all night. Good dog." He slowly and theatrically reached out his hand palm up to pet the dog. He stretched his arm across the small, dead fire pit. Ranger's reaction was the final unspoken word. He didn't growl, he didn't snap, he didn't even bare his teeth. He simply stood up, rising to his feet, with a silent, fluid grace. He took 3 deliberate steps, his claws making no sound on the hard-packed earth. He walked past the dead fire, past Tanner's outstretched, trembling hand, and he sat down. He sat directly between Tanner and Grant. He faced Tanner, his body a solid living shield, his shoulders broad, his head held high. He did not look at Grant. He didn't need to. The message was as clear as a gunshot. You will not touch him. You will not get to him. I am between you and I am watching. Tanner's hand froze in midair. He stared at the dog's broad, furry back. The contempt was absolute, a physical rejection. He slowly, very slowly, drew his hand back, clenching it into a fist at his side. Grant watched the entire exchange unfold. The fire had died, and in the gray, cold light of the new day, so had the pretense. For the first time, he could see Tanner's face clearly. The mask of the grieving victim had vanished. In its place, just for a split second, was a flash of cold, hard fury. Grant's training had already told him the man was lying. Ranger had just confirmed it. The gray dawn light was cruel, offering no warmth, only a stark, unforgiving light that laid bare the cold reality of the clearing. The fire was now a circle of white ash, and the tattered tent stood as a monument to recent terror. And there the man and the dog were a perfect portrait of absolute distrust. Grant Mercer stood up the movement, a sharp cracking sound in the deep silence. His joints were stiff, protesting after a long night spent sitting on the cold stone. He was a dark, formidable shape. Against the new light, his face a mask of weary resolve. Tanner, who had been faking a pained, fitful sleep, slowly opened his eyes. His victim mask was back in place, but it seemed thinner now, and his eyes, though clouded with pretended exhaustion, were sharp, darting from Grant to the dog and back again. "What time is it?" Tanner asked, his voice a dry, scratchy rasp. Is she—" Grant completely ignored the question. He walked to the edge of the clearing and picked up his waterproof bag. "I'm going to the plane," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that left no room for conversation. "The plane." Tanner struggled to sit up, hissing as his injured leg protested the movement. Is it time? Are we leaving?" "The morning air is different," Grant said, the lie coming to him easily. "It's denser. Sometimes the signal bounces off the atmosphere better at dawn. I'm going to try the radio again." He let the lie just hang there in the air. No signal meant no rescue. This was a line of reasoning that Tanner's act forced him to accept. "Yes," he said, nodding, the relief in his voice just a little too smooth, a little too polished. "Yes, of course. Please try the radio. We have to get off this island." "I'm leaving you some water," Grant said, walking over and dropping a plastic bottle of water and one of his foil-wrapped ration bars on the ground well out of Tanner's easy reach, forcing the man to move for it. "Don't leave this clearing. Don't you light a fire. Don't you do a thing." It was a command, not a piece of advice. "I won't. I can't," Tanner said, motioning to his heavily bandaged leg. "I'll be right here. Please just hurry." Grant turned. His leather jacket creaked softly in the cold. "Ranger, heel." The word was a release. Ranger, who had been a statue of contempt all night, finally broke his stare. He stood and shook his entire body, once a violent, rattling sound of fur and muscle, as if to shake off the man's very presence. He moved instantly to Grant's left side, his shoulder brushing his partner's thigh. Grant turned and walked out of the clearing, heading down the path towards the beach. He did not look back. He didn't need to. He could feel Tanner's eyes on his back, a hot, calculating pressure. And he could feel Ranger at his side, a silent, living radar, his rear guard. If Tanner had tried to move, if a branch had so much as snapped behind them, Ranger would have reacted before Grant's brain even registered the sound. They walked for 200 yards, the path damp and soft underfoot as the sounds of the camp faded. They were replaced by the distant rhythmic sigh of the ocean. Then, out of sight and earshot, Grant stopped. He stood for a full minute, just breathing. He had been in guard mode for 10 hours, a static defensive posture. Now he needed to hunt. He needed to find the truth, the one that was not sitting back in that clearing. He needed to find Marina and Noah. He looked down. Ranger was looking up at him, his amber eyes bright, intelligent, and questioning. He was waiting for the real command. "Okay, Mav." Grant set his voice low. He reached down and scrubbed the dog's thick ruff, his gloved fingers digging into the fur. "No more games." He stepped off the path into the dense, dark woods, pushing past a curtain of wet spruce branches. He was no longer going to the beach. That was a lie for a liar. He pointed not in a specific direction, but into the vast, unknown interior of the island. "Find," he said. The command was everything. It was not track. It was not heal. It was find. Find the missing. Find the danger. Find the scent that did not belong. Ranger's entire demeanor changed in an instant. He wasn't a guard dog anymore. He was a hunter, his nose pressed to the damp ground. He started sweeping side to side, snorting as he pulled the air deep into his lungs. Reading the island's intricate map of smells, he disregarded the path they had been following. He tuned out Grant's scent and ignored the lingering sour smell of Tanner's sweat and fear that had tainted the campsite. He was searching for something different, and then he found it. His head snapped right up. He took a couple of quick steps to his right, moving toward the spine of the granite ridge. That ridge formed the very center of the island. His nose went down, and his tail, which had been hanging low and cautious, suddenly shot out straight and rigid. He had the scent. Ranger took off, and Grant followed Dot. This wasn't a trail. It was a grueling vertical climb. Grant had to use his hands, hoisting himself up over rocks, slick with moss, and he had to weave through a tangle of ancient roots. Ranger, on the other hand, was like a ghost. He moved with an easy, four-legged power, pausing every so often to let his partner catch up. The dog's nose was always working. Grant was no stranger to the outdoors, but the steep climb left him gasping for breath, the cold air searing his lungs. He was trusting the dog completely, placing his life squarely in Ranger's paws. They climbed for 15 minutes, making their way up the ridge. As they got higher, the wind shifted, and the thick, damp smell of the forest floor was stripped away by a sharp, cold wind blowing in from the open ocean, and that wind carried a new scent with it. Grant caught it the same instant Ranger did. The dog froze on a high ledge, his nose lifted to the air, sniffing, confirming what Grant smelled too. It was faint, but it was undeniable, and it wasn't pine. It wasn't salt, and it wasn't the earthy decay of the forest. It was a sharp chemical smell, acrid and foul, the unmistakable greasy tang of diesel fuel. And underneath that, just as the report had suggested, was the sour scent of old sweat and the faint, stale smell of tobacco. This was it. This was the other boat, the one from the journal, the one Marina had spotted, and the one Tanner had conveniently failed to mention. Ranger let out a single low woof, a sound of both confirmation and urgency. He was pulling on the leash now, the scent strong in his nostrils as they finally reached the top of the ridge. Up here the wind was a physical force howling past Grant's ears, whipping his hair. From this vantage point he could see the ocean, but it wasn't the calm, gray water of his home cove. This was the north side of the island, a wild, churning expanse of white-capped waves. Ranger was already on the move, leading him down a steep, treacherous animal trail, his paws knocking small stones loose that went rattling down into the abyss. The sound of the ocean swelled from a sigh to a roar. This was not the gentle lapping of the beach. This was the harsh, crashing sound of waves smashing against sheer rock. As they descended, the smell of diesel grew so strong it was almost sickening. The trail ended abruptly at a sheer 50-foot drop onto a narrow ledge of rock. Grant stopped his hand grabbing Ranger's harness to keep him from going over the edge. He looked down. It was a different cove, a hidden cove, just as the intel had suggested. It was a jagged black rock inlet, a natural trap almost invisible from the sea. And down there, tucked against the rocks, listing to one side, battered by the surf, was a boat. It was an old, ugly motor yacht, maybe 40 feet long. Its paint scarred its engine silent. It was the source of the diesel. It was the lair. The roar of the North Atlantic felt like a physical assault as Grant Mercer lay flat on the granite ridge, the wind tearing at his jacket, his eyes watering from the biting cold and the sting of the salt spray. 50 feet below, in the jagged black rock cove, the battered motor yacht was a prisoner. Waves, white and angry, smashed against its hull, making the entire vessel groan and scrape against the unforgiving rocks. It was clearly run aground. Ranger was right beside him, his body pressed low to the stone, his gray and white fur whipped by the wind. The dog's ears were pinned flat against his head, but his nose was still working overtime, pulling in the overwhelming, acrid smell of diesel fuel. This was the place. Grant scanned the cliff face. It was a sheer 50-foot drop, but it wasn't smooth. It was fractured, ancient granite, full of crevices and small ledges. To his right, a narrow chimney, a deep crack in the rock, looked like a treacherous but possible path down. This wasn't a choice. He had to go. "Mav!" he shouted over the wind, his voice nearly snatched away. But he didn't need to shout. He pointed to the dog, then to himself, and then to the path. "Easy," he commanded. "Stay close." The descent was a controlled fall, and Grant went first, his boots searching for impossibly small toeholds in the rock, his gloved fingers numb and stiff. He gripped the cold, wet stone, moving with a ranger's practiced economy, testing every hold, keeping his body light and his mind focused only on the next 3 feet. Ranger was right behind him, a four-legged miracle of agility. The dog moved with an instinctive animal grace, his claws finding purchase where Grant's boots slipped. His body was low and balanced when a piece of rock broke loose under Grant's boot. He slipped his body, lurching, but his left hand held firm as a small cascade of pebbles went rattling down to the beach, a sound completely swallowed by the crashing waves. He froze his heart, hammering, but no one on the boat below reacted. He regained his footing and continued. It took 5 agonizingly long minutes, but they finally reached the bottom. The beach wasn't made of sand, but a treacherous field of black stones slick with algae and about the size of fists. The motor yacht was 30 yards away. It was old, maybe from the 1980s. Its white and blue paint was scarred and peeling, and it was beached hard, its stern tilted up onto the rocks. And it was not abandoned. Even over the roar of the surf, Grant heard it, a sharp, metallic, clinking sound. That was followed by a loud, muffled curse, a growl of pure frustration. Grant signaled Ranger with a flat, downward slicing motion of his hand to be quiet. Ranger instantly froze, sinking into the shadows of the cliff wall. Grant moved his feet silent on the wet stones, timing his steps with the rhythmic crash and retreat of the waves as he slipped from one large boulder to the next. Closing the distance, he saw the source of the noise on the boat's aft deck. A large, burly man in a stained, grease-covered jacket was hunched over the open engine compartment. This was Briggs. He was holding a large wrench, and he looked furious. He hit the engine block with the side of the tool. Another loud, clanging sound. "Piece of junk!" Briggs growled, his voice a low bark that the wind carried to Grant. Briggs was distracted. He was angry. He was focused on the engine. This was the moment. Grant was about to move to find a way to board when he froze again. He heard another sound. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't Briggs, and it wasn't the waves. It was a low, then a rhythmic thump, thump, thump. The sound was muffled, but it was definitely coming from inside the boat. Someone was kicking at a wall. Someone was alive in there. In an instant, the entire mission changed. This was no longer just a hunt. It had just become a hostage rescue, and Grant Mercer knew with absolute certainty Exactly what he had to do. He looked over at Ranger and gave the stay signal a simple gesture with an open palm. The dog didn't so much as twitch. His body was coiled like a spring, his eyes locked on his partner. Grant slipped out from the shadow of the rocks, his pistol drawn, but held low at his side. The sound of the crashing waves masked his approach as he reached the back of the boat. The boat lurched violently as a large wave hit it, the sudden movement disorienting. Briggs cursed again, bracing himself against the engine with his back to Grant, who was now climbing onto the deck. His boots made no sound on the wet surface. He was just 3 feet behind Briggs, but he wouldn't use his gun. A gunshot would echo across the water, giving away his position. He needed to take this man down silently. He made his move, holstering his weapon in one fluid, brutal motion. His left arm snaked around Briggs's thick neck, his forearm cinching tight against the man's throat. His right hand locked onto the back of Briggs's head, completing the powerful chokehold. Briggs's reaction was immediate. He let out a huge, panicked grunt as his body arched backward. His thick arms began to flail, and he dropped the heavy wrench with a loud, metallic clatter on the deck. He tried to kick back, but Grant held his balance perfectly. Keeping his center of gravity low, Grant was immovable, as Briggs's hands clawed desperately at his arm. But the hold was perfect. It wasn't about cutting off air, it was about pressure. 10 seconds passed. Briggs's struggles began to weaken. At 12 seconds, his body went completely limp. Grant held the choke for 3 more seconds to be sure, then gently eased the unconscious man down to the deck. He was alive, just out cold. Grant quickly found a length of nylon rope inside a deck locker. He hog-tied Briggs's hands and feet, his movements swift and his knots expertly tied. The thumping from inside the cabin grew frantic. Whoever was in there had clearly heard the wrench fall. Grant turned his attention to the cabin door. It was closed and secured with a padlock. A heavy brass lock was fastened on the outside. He glanced around and saw Briggs's toolbox lying open. He grabbed a short, heavy crowbar and jammed its tip between the hasp and the wooden door frame. He threw his full weight on it and wrenched downward. The wood splintered with a sharp cracking sound. The lock tore free. He ripped the door open, and the stench that poured out hit him like a physical blow. A gut-wrenching mix of diesel, saltwater mildew, and human waste. "Ranger with me," Grant commanded, and the dog was on deck in a flash. Bounding down the dark steps ahead of him, Grant followed with his pistol drawn, his tactical flashlight cutting a bright white beam into the blackness. "Hello!" a woman's muffled voice screamed. "Please help us!" The main cabin was a total disaster, its tables and chairs overturned by the storm. Ranger was already at a door in the forward bulkhead, scratching at it and whining frantically. Grant didn't hesitate. He kicked the door, and the flimsy wood splintered open. He shined the light inside, and his blood ran cold. They were huddled in the darkness of the small, triangular V-berth, cowering from the light, a man and a woman. Their mouths were sealed with duct tape, and their hands and feet were bound with zip ties. The woman was Marina. Her eyes wide and terrified above the tape were the same eyes he had imagined when he read her journal. The man beside her was Noah, the real Noah. And he was pale. His face slick with sweat, his body shivering uncontrollably. He had a high fever. His leg was stretched out, a crude, bloody bandage wrapped around his calf. "I'm here to help," Grant said, his voice softer than he'd intended. He holstered his pistol and pulled out his knife as Ranger moved in close, pushing his head into Marina's bound hands, whining and licking the tears from her face. Grant cut the tape from Marina's mouth first. She gasped, taking a ragged, desperate lungful of air before bursting into sobs. "Noah! My husband! Save Noah!" Grant sliced through her bonds. He then moved to Noah and cut the tape. The man's skin was burning hot. He was barely conscious. "It's okay," Marina was sobbing, clinging to Grant's arm. "It's okay. Who are you? How did you find us?" "My name is Grant Mercer. I saw your SOS. I read your journal." He cut Noah's last bond. "We need to get you out of here." "The other man. The one who was at your camp. His name is Tanner." The truth tumbled out of Marina, then her words coming fast and frantic, tripping over each other in a rush of pure terror and relief. "Yes, Tanner. Their boat crashed in the storm, just like ours. They found us at our camp." "What were they after?" Grant asked. His mind was piecing it all together. They had cargo," she whispered. Her eyes grew wide. "Bags. Dark, heavy-looking bags. They wanted our supplies. They wanted... I'm not sure what else." It was Noah who whispered, his voice a dry and feverish rasp. "Noah fought back. He tried to protect me. He's an engineer, you know," Marina said, clutching her husband's hand. "He's strong. He fought back while Tanner was getting rough with me." Noah grabbed a tool from his bag, a sharp metal file, and he went after him with it. He got Tanner in the leg, right in the calf. Grant froze. The wound, that deep cut. "They were going to finish us," Marina cried out, her voice rising. "Briggs, the big one. He had a rope. They were starting to tie us up, and then we heard it." "Heard what?" Grant asked, his voice tense. "Your plane." Noah whispered, his eyes fluttering open. "We heard your engine way off in the distance. But we heard it. And Tanner, he just stopped cold. He looked up toward the sky." Marina added, her face a mask of horrified memory. "He glanced down at his leg, at the blood, and then he looked over at Briggs. He told Briggs to hide us and keep us quiet. He said, 'I've got an idea. That signal, it's not a trap. It's an opportunity.' And then he just took off running. He ran toward the beach, toward the sound of your plane. We've been stuck in here ever since. We honestly thought we were going to perish in this place." The whole sickening, brilliant deception suddenly clicked into place, playing the victim the whole performance, the wound he'd actually gotten from the smugglers. It was all a lie, a masterful, terrible improvisation built on a foundation of real, agonizing pain. And the man who had pulled it off Tanner was back at the camp, and he was armed. He was waiting. And by now he'd be wondering where Grant had disappeared to. "We have to move right now." Marina was clearly in shock, her hands fluttering nervously. Sobs were catching in her throat, but Noah, the real Noah, though weak and burning up with fever, he heard the authority in Grant's voice. He was a survivor. He nodded, his eyes grim, and said, "Help me up." Noah rasped. Grant didn't hesitate for a second, pulling the man's arm over his shoulder, taking the man's full weight. "Ranger, point," he commanded. But the dog was already heading up the steps, just a gray shadow in the dark companionway. They finally emerged onto the deck. The wind was still howling, and the unconscious form of Briggs, who was bound and tied, lay right where Grant had left him. Marina gasped and flinched away, but Grant simply pulled Noah toward the cliff. "We're climbing," he said. The next 30 minutes were a nightmare, a brutal fight against gravity on the 50-foot climb up the rock chimney. A climb that had been treacherous for Grant by himself was now nearly impossible with a wounded, feverish man. Grant moved like a machine, pushing Noah up onto a ledge, and then climbing right past him, only to reach down and haul the injured man up by his harness. Marina, fueled by a terror that had completely burned away her shock, scrambled ahead of them. Her fingers raw, her breath came in sobs carried by the wind. Ranger was the first one to reach the top, and he immediately took up a defensive position, scanning the trail they had just climbed. His body was low to the ground, his ears pinned back against the wind. When Grant finally hauled Noah over the edge of the ridge, they all collapsed, panting, on the wind-blasted granite. We can't go on," Marina panted. "We have to," Grant said, getting to his feet, his own legs trembling with exhaustion. He looked back in the direction of the camp. He knows we're gone. And he's coming for us." That was all the motivation they needed. Their journey back across the spine of the island became a desperate, lurching race against the clock. Noah was practically a dead weight, but he was trying his feet, dragging, as his body was held up between Grant and Marina. Ranger moved ahead of them, then circled back, keeping a frantic, silent perimeter, his nose sampling every scent on the wind, his eyes scanning the dense woods. And then through a break in the trees, they saw it. The calm, gray water of the South Cove, and floating there was a beautiful and impossible sight, the red and white Cessna airplane. They stumbled down the final path, the very same one Grant had taken when he first arrived. They burst out from the trees onto the small, quiet beach. "Get him inside," Grant ordered. It was a clumsy, difficult process as they trudged through the shallow, icy water. Grant and Marina finally maneuvered Noah onto the plane's float and then into the cabin, laying him out flat across the 2 rear seats. Marina scrambled in right after him, her hands immediately flying to her husband's face, whispering his name. Grant slid into the pilot's seat, and Ranger leaped in beside him, shaking the cold water from his fur. Grant's hand went for the ignition key, but he paused to grab the radio handset first. He knew it was a long shot with the dead zone created by the cliffs. It had been useless before, but he had to try. "Mayday, mayday, mayday," he said, his voice low and urgent, not really expecting a reply. "This is Cessna, November 5185 Kilo at Moose Call Island, South Cove." There was a burst of static, and then, 85 Kilo, this is United States Coast Guard Bar Harbor Station. I read you. What is your situation?" The voice was a miracle. Calm, professional, and full of authority. Grant felt a wave of relief so powerful his knees nearly buckled. It had worked. Whether it was the atmosphere, the time of day, or just a simple act of grace, it didn't matter. "Bar Harbor, this is 85 Kilo, Grant replied, his voice steady now. "I have 2 rescued civilians, one in critical condition with a fever and a leg wound. I also have 2 hostiles on the island. One is secured on the north side. The second one is at large, armed and dangerous." "Understood, 85 Kilo, the voice came back. "This is Commander Holt. We have a Jayhawk helicopter spinning up right now. Can you provide a sit rep on the second hostile?" "Negative, Bar Harbor. He's the man who faked the—" Grant's words were cut short. Ranger the dog wasn't looking at Grant. He wasn't looking at the radio. He was staring completely rigid at the beach. His eyes were locked on the dark opening of the trail, and a low, vicious, terrifying sound was vibrating deep in his chest, a growl so profound it was felt more than heard. "No," Marina whispered from the back, her voice a fragile thread of new terror. A figure emerged from the woods. It was Tanner. He was a waking nightmare. The mask of the victim had vanished, replaced by a face contorted with pure animalistic rage. He was hobbling, dragging that bandaged leg behind him, yet he moved with a terrifying and deliberate speed. Clutched in his right hand was a dark, snub-nosed pistol. "You!" he shrieked. His voice was a raw, broken sound, tearing through the air. He was on the beach about 20 yards away, wading into the shallow water, his voice cracking with rage. You left me." He raised the pistol, aiming it directly at Grant, a clean shot right through the windshield. Grant's own firearm was still in its holster, pinned by his seatbelt. He was completely exposed, a sitting duck. "Grant!" Marina screamed. Tanner's hand steadied on the weapon as he took careful aim. "Ranger!" Grant's voice was low, a single, sharp command. "Get him!" The dog didn't need to be told twice. He became a streak of gray and white fur. He launched himself from the passenger seat, flying over Grant's lap, out the open door, and onto the plane's float. In one explosive motion, he hit the water. Tanner saw the animal charging toward him. His aim faltered, shifting from Grant to the dog, just as a sharp, flat crack echoed off the cliffs. The gun fired, but the bullet went wide, striking the water with a harmless white splash, and Ranger didn't even flinch. He covered the distance through the shallows in 3 powerful leaps. Tanner tried to aim again, but it was too late. Ranger didn't lunge for the arm holding the gun, nor did he go for the throat. He knew precisely what to do. He slammed his 90-pound body into Tanner at full speed. The impact was aimed directly at Tanner's injured left leg. The sound that followed wasn't a gunshot. It was a heavy, sickening thud, followed by a high-pitched, thin scream that barely sounded human. Tanner's leg, already torn and battered, couldn't withstand the force of the impact. It gave way instantly. Tanner collapsed into the shallow water, his body folding like a puppet with its strings cut. The pistol flew from his limp fingers, disappearing beneath the gray water. He landed in a crumpled heap, clutching his leg, his screams turning into agonized animal-like sobs. Ranger stood over him, his chest heaving. His teeth were bared, a low growl rumbling in his chest. He didn't bite. He didn't have to. The threat was neutralized. By then, Grant was out of the plane, his own gun drawn, wading through the water. He kicked Tanner's pistol deeper into the mud. He looked down at the man who was now just a pathetic, broken figure, whimpering in the surf. Then he heard a deep thumping sound that wasn't coming from his own plane's engine. Then came a sound growing louder as it echoed off the cliffs, a U.S. Coast Guard Jayhawk helicopter. Painted a bright orange and white, it appeared over the southern ridge. It moved fast, settling onto the small beach in a deafening whirlwind of sand and prop wash. The side door slid open, and out came medics and armed Coast Guard personnel. A man in a crisp uniform, likely in his 50s, with sharp, intelligent eyes, jumped down and strode toward Grant. "Commander Holt," he said, not offering a hand, but simply sizing Grant up. "Mercer," Grant replied, holstering his weapon. "He's the second hostile. His partner Briggs is on the north side in a beached motor yacht. He's incapacitated." "We'll get him," Holt said, his gaze shifting from Grant to the dog, who was now sitting calmly at Grant's side. "You did good work, Mr. Mercer." The medics were already by the plane, carefully easing Noah onto a stretcher. Marina climbed out her face, a mixture of tears and relief, and ran to Grant, throwing her arms around him. Her body was shaking. "Thank you," she sobbed. "Thank you." Grant froze. He wasn't used to this kind of contact, and awkwardly patted her on the back. "They'll take care of you," he said as he and Ranger stepped back. They watched the medics work with practiced efficiency and calm precision. They saw them load Noah into the helicopter. Marina climbed in after him, never letting go of her husband's hand. She looked back at Grant, her eyes saying more than words ever could. The helicopter lifted off its powerful rotor wash, tearing at Grant's jacket. The suspects were secured by the remaining Coast Guard crew, and then suddenly it was quiet. The island was silent again except for the wind as Grant stood on the beach. The cold air chilled his damp clothes. He was alone again, just him and his dog. He had expected that old familiar hollowness to return, the emptiness that came after a mission was over. He braced for the cold ache of his self-imposed solitude. But this time it didn't come. He watched the helicopter shrink into a small black dot against the clearing sky. He thought of Marina and Noah, finally safe. He thought of the journal. He thought of Colton. This time he had been there. This time he had not been helpless. He was still alone here on this empty beach, but for the first time in years the solitude didn't feel heavy. It didn't feel like a punishment. Just then, Ranger gently nudged his cold, wet nose into Grant's hand. Grant glanced down at his faithful friend. "Let's go home, Mav," he said softly. He untied the plane and climbed inside. Ranger hopped into his usual spot, his fur already starting to dry. Grant fired up the engine, and its familiar, deafening roar filled the cabin. The plane lifted off, climbing steadily out of the cove. As the gray-green island shrank behind them, he banked the Cessna, pointing its nose toward the mainland, toward home. He reached over and rested a hand on Ranger's head, and the dog leaned into the comforting touch. A low, contented rumble came from the dog's chest, a peaceful sound against the engine's constant drone. It was still a wall of noise, but the silence inside Grant's own heart, the one he had spent his life running from, the one that had always been, haunted by the echoes of his past, was finally different. This was no longer an escape. It was a sense of peace reclaimed at last. The story of Grant and Ranger reminds us that true loyalty, the kind that never asks for anything in return, can be an anchor in the stormiest of seas. Their journey shows us that even when we feel lost among the echoes of our past, a brave and faithful heart can guide us back to the present, helping us find the peace we thought was gone forever. If this special bond resonates with you, we warmly invite you to become part of our community. Your support by subscribing, liking, and sharing this story allows us to continue bringing these tales to life. We would be truly honored to read your own reflections in the comments section below. And the journey doesn't have to end here. Our next story is already on the screen, just waiting for you.